Good evening, my friend. Welcome back. This is day 2 of my rather unusual challenge. If you were here yesterday, you already know what this is about. But if tonight is the first time you've found this little corner of the internet, then allow me to explain. Every night, I sit down here, in the quiet, and I tell a story. A slow story, a calm story, something gentle enough to help you relax, clear your mind, and slowly drift towards sleep. And if you enjoy these quiet journeys into history and fantasy, you're always welcome to subscribe and return tomorrow night for another story. I will keep doing this every night, until I finally manage to get a girlfriend. Yes, that is the challenge. Some people try dating apps. Some people go to parties. Some people somehow manage to start conversations with strangers without feeling like their soul is leaving their body. I, however, have chosen a slightly different strategy. I will simply keep telling stories at night, until life eventually decides to help me out. It might take a week. It might take a month. Knowing my current level of romantic success, it might take quite a long time. But that's alright. Stories are patient things. And tonight, we continue. Before we begin the story for this evening, though, I should give you a small update. After all, part of this strange series is also about the life of the storyteller himself. Today was mostly an ordinary day. I went to the university like usual, sat through a few long lectures, pretended to understand at least 70% of what the professor was saying. You know, a very typical academic day. Students quietly typing on laptops, some people taking notes, others fighting a losing battle against sleep. Nothing particularly exciting. At least, that's what I thought. Until something small happened during one of the lectures. I noticed someone. A girl. Now, before your imagination starts creating some dramatic romantic scene, I should warn you nothing dramatic actually happened. She simply walked into the room a few minutes late. She apologized to the professor in a soft voice, then quickly found a seat a few rows ahead of me. That was it. No music playing in the background. No cinematic moment. Just a girl arriving slightly late to class. But for some reason, I noticed her. Maybe it was the way she seemed completely calm, even though the rest of the room looked tired and stressed. Or maybe it was simply one of those small moments when your brain decides to pay attention to something it normally wouldn't. And for a brief moment, I had a thought. A very bold thought. What if I talked to her? Now, for most people, this might sound like a very small idea. But for someone like me, it felt like planning a diplomatic meeting between two rival kingdoms. Because immediately after that first thought, another one appeared. A louder one. What exactly would you say? And suddenly my brain became extremely creative. It started imagining every possible awkward scenario. Maybe I would say something strange. Maybe she would look confused. Maybe I would forget how to form sentences entirely. Or worse, maybe I would walk over there and immediately regret every life decision that led to that moment. So instead, I did what many nervous men throughout history have done. Absolutely nothing. I stayed where I was. She stayed where she was. And the lecture continued peacefully, as if the entire situation had never existed. Not exactly a heroic moment. But that's alright. Because this little challenge of mine isn't about instant victories. It's about small steps. Slow progress. And maybe, just maybe, gaining a little more courage each day. So here is my promise for tonight. If I see her again tomorrow, I will at least try to say something. Nothing dramatic. No grand romantic speech. Just a simple hello. Even the longest journeys begin with something small. But for now, night has arrived. The day is over. The world outside is slowly growing quiet. And here beside us, our quiet listener is already asleep. Daenerys Targaryen herself wrapped in striped pajamas, resting peacefully while her dragon keeps watch nearby. Even dragon queens need their sleep. And while she dreams, we can travel through history together. So take a deep breath, relax your shoulders, let the noise of the day slowly fade away. Because tonight's tale is about to begin. Long before dragons darkened the skies of Westeros, long before the Iron Throne existed, the continent was a very different place. It was not a single kingdom. It was not even close. Instead, Westeros was a land divided, a vast continent broken into several powerful realms, each ruled by its own king, each proud, ancient, and fiercely independent. In those days, the idea that one ruler could control the entire continent would have sounded almost impossible. Every region had its own traditions, its own culture, and its own royal bloodline that had ruled for generations. These were the 7 kingdoms. Not united kingdoms, but separate ones, each with its own ambitions, each with its own history, and of course, each with its own rivalries. To the north, stretching far beyond forests and frozen plains, ruled the ancient kings of winter, the House Stark of Winterfell. Their kingdom was enormous, larger than all the others, but also harsh and cold. Life there demanded strength and endurance. The Starks had ruled the north for thousands of years, long before many southern kingdoms even existed. Further south lay the fertile lands of the Reach, ruled by the proud House Gardener in the ancient city of Highgarden. Their lands were rich with crops, rivers, and warm sunlight, making them one of the wealthiest kingdoms in Westeros. To the west stood the Kingdom of the Rock, ruled by the powerful House Lannister from the mighty fortress of Casterly Rock, a castle carved into a mountain overlooking the sea. Gold flowed from mines beneath their lands, and with gold came influence, armies, and power. Along the eastern coast stretched the lands known as the Vale, ruled by Houserin from their famous mountain fortress, the Eyrie. Their castle stood high above the clouds, protected by steep mountains and narrow passes that made invasion almost impossible. South of them lay the Riverlands, a region crisscrossed by rivers and fertile valleys. But unlike other kingdoms, the Riverlands rarely enjoyed long periods of peace. Because of their central location, they were often caught in the middle of wars between stronger neighbors. Further south still was the ancient kingdom of the Stormlands, ruled by the fierce Storm Kings of House Durrandon. Their castles were built to withstand violent coastal storms and constant attacks from rival powers. And finally, to the far south, under warm suns and red mountains, lay the proud kingdom of Dorne. The Dornish were different from the rest of Westeros, independent, resilient, and fiercely protective of their freedom. 7 kingdoms, 7 kings, 7 crowns. But despite the name 7 kingdoms, peace between them was rare. In truth, Westeros was almost always at war. Borders shifted constantly. Old grudges lasted for generations. Kings fought over land, castles, trade routes, and sometimes simply over pride. Armies marched across the continent again and again. Castles were besieged. Fields were burned. And alliances changed as quickly as the seasons. One year 2 kingdoms might stand together as allies. The next year they might face each other across a battlefield. Because there was no central authority. No emperor. No high king. No single ruler powerful enough to command all the others. Each king believed his crown was legitimate. Each kingdom believed its independence was sacred. And so the continent remained divided. Powerful, but fractured. The Starks ruled the north. The Lannisters ruled the west. The Gardeners ruled the Reach. The Arryns ruled the Vale. The Durrandons ruled the Stormlands. The Princes of Dorne ruled the far south. And between them all, countless rivalries simmered quietly, waiting for the next spark of war. For thousands of years, this balance unstable as it was continued. Kings rose. Kings fell. Dynasties changed. But the structure of Westeros remained the same. 7 kingdoms. 7 rulers. 7 separate powers competing for influence. No one believed that would ever change. No one imagined that one day, a foreign family from across the narrow sea would arrive. A family with dragons. And when they did, the entire world of Westeros would be transformed forever. Far to the east of Westeros, across the narrow sea, stood a dark island fortress known as Dragonstone. Even today, Dragonstone feels different from the rest of Westeros. The castle itself is built from black stone shaped into twisting towers, dragon heads, and massive walls that seem almost alive. Everything about it feels ancient, and slightly mysterious. But Dragonstone was not originally built by the people of Westeros. It was built by the Valyrians. Long before the rise of the Targaryens in Westeros, there existed a mighty civilization across the sea known as Valyria. It was not simply a kingdom, but a vast empire that dominated much of the known world. The Valyrians were famous for 2 things above all else: dragons and fire. They were the only people in the world who had mastered the art of taming dragons. With these enormous creatures, they built an empire that stretched across continents. Their armies were powerful, but their dragons made them nearly unstoppable. Cities burned before them. Kingdoms surrendered. And the Valyrian freehold became one of the greatest powers the world had ever seen. Many noble families ruled within Valyria, but among them was a smaller dragonlord house known as House Targaryen. They were not the most powerful family of the freehold, but they were still dragon riders, and that alone placed them among the elite of Valyrian society. Around 2 centuries before the events that would shape Westeros forever, the Targaryens made an unusual decision. They left Valyria. The head of the family at that time, Aegon Targaryen, chose to move his entire household across the sea to the island fortress of Dragonstone. Why? Because of a dream. According to Targaryen legend, Aenar's daughter Daenerys the Dreamer had a terrifying vision. In her dream, she saw Valyria destroyed by fire and darkness. A disaster so enormous that the entire civilization would be wiped away. Many people dismissed the dream, but Aenar believed his daughter. And so the Targaryens abandoned the great cities of Valyria and settled instead on the lonely volcanic island of Dragonstone. For years, nothing happened. Valyria continued to thrive. Its empire remained powerful. And perhaps many people believed the dream had been nothing more than imagination, until the day it happened. The event would later become known as the Doom of Valyria. Without warning, the heart of the Valyrian Empire was destroyed. Massive volcanic eruptions shattered the land. Mountains exploded with fire. The skies filled with ash and smoke. Cities collapsed, and entire regions were swallowed by fire and molten stone. Dragons died. Armies vanished. And the once mighty empire of Valyria was completely annihilated in a single catastrophic event. The world had never seen destruction like it. Almost every dragonlord family perished. The greatest civilization of the age simply disappeared. But far away from the disaster, on the dark island fortress of Dragonstone, one small Valyrian family survived. House Targaryen. Because they had left years earlier, because one young girl had seen a terrible vision, the Targaryens became the last surviving dragonlords in the world. For nearly a century after the Doom, they remained on Dragonstone, a quiet but powerful family, watching the continent of Westeros from across the sea. And eventually, the fate of that continent would fall into the hands of 3 siblings, Aegon Targaryen, and his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys. Aegon was calm, intelligent, and determined. He was not known for cruelty, but he possessed a quiet confidence that suggested he believed deeply in his destiny. His older sister, Visenya, was very different. She was fierce, disciplined, and a skilled warrior who carried a Valyrian steel sword called Dark Sister. Many considered her the more intimidating of the 2 sisters. Rhaenys, the younger sister, had a lighter spirit. She loved music, flight, and freedom, and she was known to be the most charismatic of the 3. But they all shared one important thing. They were dragon riders. Each of them commanded a dragon of immense size and power. Aegon rode Balerion, the Black Dread, the largest and most terrifying dragon in the world. Visenya rode Viagar, a powerful and battle-hardened dragon. And Rhaenys rode Meraxes, swift and graceful in the skies. Together, the 3 siblings possessed something no king in Westeros had ever faced before: dragons. And soon, they would decide that the divided kingdoms of Westeros should belong to them. Before Aegon Targaryen ever set foot on the shores of Westeros, before banners were raised and kingdoms began to fall, there was something that made the Targaryens unlike any other power in the world: their dragons. In the centuries after the Doom of Valyria, most dragons had vanished along with the empire that once ruled the skies. Entire bloodlines of dragonlords had been destroyed in a single catastrophic event. But on the volcanic island of Dragonstone, 3 dragons remained. They were not simply animals. They were living weapons. Creatures of fire and flight, capable of destroying armies and burning entire castles to the ground. And these 3 dragons belonged to Aegon Targaryen and his sisters. The first and most terrifying was Balerion, known throughout history as Balerion the Black Dread. Balerion was enormous even by the standards of dragons. His scales were as dark as midnight, and when he spread his wings, they were said to be large enough to cast entire villages into shadow. His flames burned hotter than any forge. Stone could melt beneath his fire. Legends say that when Balerion flew across the sky, people below would stop and stare in silence, because the sound of his wings alone felt like the approach of a storm. Among all the dragons that ever lived, Balerion was the greatest, and he carried Aegon himself upon his back. The second dragon was Viagar, ridden by Aegon's sister Visenya. Viagar was not as large as Balerion, but she was still an immense and terrifying creature. Her scales shimmered with a deep bronze-green color, and her eyes burned like hot embers in the darkness. If Balerion represented overwhelming power, Viagar represented relentless strength. She had flown in battles before the conquest of Westeros even began, and she was known to be aggressive in the skies. When Vhagar attacked, she did so with brutal precision. Many soldiers who later faced the Targaryens would say that seeing a dragon in flight was one thing, but seeing Vhagar diving from the clouds was something else entirely. The third dragon was Meraxes, ridden by Aegon's younger sister Rhaenys. Meraxes was slightly smaller than the other two, but no less magnificent. Her scales were a pale silver color that seemed almost to glow in sunlight. Her eyes were said to be bright and watchful, and she moved through the sky with incredible speed and grace. Where Balerion inspired terror and Vhagar commanded fear, Meraxes inspired awe. But she was still a dragon. Her flames could sweep across battlefields like a living storm of fire. Together, these three creatures formed something the kings of Westeros had never seen before, a force no army could truly prepare for. Imagine, for a moment, what it must have felt like for soldiers on the ground. An army standing in formation, shields raised, banners flying proudly in the wind. And then, a shadow passes overhead. The sky darkens. The air begins to tremble with the thunder of wings. And suddenly, fire falls from the heavens. This was the power of dragons. And with three of them, Aegon Targaryen possessed a weapon unlike anything in the known world. But dragons alone do not start wars. They only decide them. The true question was this: why did Aegon decide to conquer Westeros in the first place? For nearly a century after the doom of Valyria, House Targaryen had lived quietly on Dragonstone. They were powerful, yes, but they had not attempted to rule the continent across the sea. The Seven Kingdoms remained divided, each ruled by its own king. But Aegon saw something others did not. He saw opportunity. The kingdoms of Westeros were strong individually, but they were constantly fighting each other. Old rivalries weakened them. Borders were disputed. Alliances changed from year to year. In many ways, the continent was powerful, yet deeply unstable. Aegon believed something radical. He believed Westeros should be united under one ruler. Not seven kings. One king. Some historians say Aegon sought glory. Others believe he simply wanted power. But some legends claim something more mysterious. They say Aegon may have known that a divided Westeros would one day face dangers far greater than simple wars between kings. Whatever his reasons were, his decision was made. He would conquer Westeros. But Aegon was not reckless. He did not simply fly his dragons across the sea and attack. Instead, he began preparing carefully. First, he strengthened his position on Dragonstone. Then he sent envoys across the continent, studying the kingdoms, learning their rivalries, and understanding their weaknesses. Some lords were willing to listen. Others ignored him completely. But slowly, quietly, Aegon began building alliances. Certain houses saw opportunity in supporting him. Others believed it was wiser to stand beside a dragonlord than against one. At the same time, Aegon and his sisters studied the political map of Westeros. They planned their campaign carefully. Where to land, which kingdoms to confront first, which rulers might bend the knee, and which would need to be defeated in battle. By the time the preparations were complete, the plan was clear. 3 dragon riders, 3 dragons, and a continent divided into 7 rival kingdoms. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic conquests in the history of Westeros. And soon, the first banners of war would rise. When the preparations were finally complete, Aegon Targaryen made his move. For years he had planned carefully from Dragonstone, studying the kingdoms of Westeros, understanding their rivalries, and deciding exactly how his conquest would begin. Now the moment had arrived. Aegon did not begin his campaign by attacking one of the great castles of Westeros. Instead, he chose something far more strategic. He chose a quiet stretch of land along the eastern coast of the continent, a place near the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, where the river met the sea. At the time, the location was not important. There were no great cities there. No famous castles. Just forests, fishing villages, and open land. But Aegon saw potential. From that shoreline, armies could travel easily into the heart of several different kingdoms. The river provided access inland, and the nearby bay allowed ships to arrive safely. It was the perfect place to begin. So Aegon landed. With him came his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, their armies, and of course, their 3 dragons. Balerion, Vhagar, Meraxes. The arrival of the Targaryens must have been a terrifying sight. Warships filling the bay. Soldiers marching onto the shore. And above them all, the shadows of dragons circling the sky. The landing itself was peaceful. No army stood waiting to stop them. No king expected an invasion from the sea led by dragon riders. And so Aegon began building. The very first structure he ordered constructed was a wooden fort. A simple defensive position meant to protect the landing site and serve as the base of his campaign. It was not yet the mighty Red Keep that would one day dominate the city. It was just a small stronghold made of timber and earth. But it marked the beginning of something enormous. Around that fort, soldiers began building camps, docks, and supply areas. Ships continued arriving from Dragonstone carrying more men, food, weapons, and materials. Slowly, the Targaryen presence on the continent grew stronger. No one knew it at the time, but this very location would eventually become the greatest city in Westeros. King's Landing. Aegon had not yet built a capital, but the seed of one had just been planted. Once the landing site was secure, Aegon took the next step. He sent out messengers. Riders traveled across the 7 kingdoms carrying the same message to every king, every lord, and every ruler who held power in Westeros. The message was simple, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. Aegon Targaryen, Lord of Dragonstone and last heir of the Dragonlords of Valyria, had arrived in Westeros, and he was claiming the continent for himself. Each king was given a choice. They could submit peacefully, recognize Aegon as their ruler, and keep their lands as loyal lords under a new united kingdom, or they could resist. But resistance would have consequences. The message that reached the rulers of Westeros became famous for its brutal simplicity. Bend the knee, or burn. It was not an empty threat. Every messenger carried the same warning. Aegon had 3 dragons, and the kings of Westeros had none. Some rulers laughed when they heard the message. Others were furious. Many believed this foreign lord from Dragonstone was arrogant beyond reason. After all, Westeros had been ruled by powerful dynasties for thousands of years. Why would they surrender their crowns to an outsider? Why would kings kneel to a conqueror who had only just arrived? But there were also those who understood the danger immediately. Stories of dragons had not disappeared from the world. Everyone knew what they were capable of. Entire cities in ancient Essos had once burned beneath dragonfire. Armies had been destroyed in moments. And now 3 dragons had arrived in Westeros. The kings of the continent faced a choice none of their ancestors had ever faced before. Submit, or fight. And as the messages spread across the 7 kingdoms, banners began to rise. Armies began to gather. And the first battles of Aegon's conquest were about to begin. Once Aegon's messages spread across Westeros, the reactions were exactly what he expected. Some lords understood the reality of the situation immediately. They had heard the stories. 3 dragons had landed on the continent. Not rumors, not legends, but real dragons, ridden by dragonlords from the blood of Valyria. For many smaller houses, the choice was obvious. They bent the knee. Rather than risk the destruction of their castles and lands, several lords traveled directly to Aegon's new fort on the Blackwater and swore loyalty to him. In return, Aegon allowed them to keep their titles and their lands. This was an important part of his strategy. Aegon was not trying to destroy the nobility of Westeros. He wanted them to serve him. Every lord who submitted peacefully made his conquest easier. Each new ally brought soldiers, resources, and knowledge of the land. But not everyone was willing to surrender. Many powerful rulers believed they could defeat this invading force. After all, Westeros had strong armies and ancient castles that had survived centuries of war. Some kings believed dragons were dangerous, but not unbeatable. So resistance began. The first battles of Aegon's conquest were relatively small. A few local armies marched against his forces, hoping to push the invaders back into the sea before they could establish themselves on the continent. But these battles quickly revealed something terrifying. Dragons completely changed the nature of warfare. In one early conflict, an enemy army formed traditional battle lines, shields raised, archers behind them, cavalry waiting for the signal to charge. Then the sky darkened. Aegon and his sisters appeared above the battlefield. Bael Ryan, Viagar, Maraxes. The soldiers on the ground had never seen creatures like this before. As the dragons descended, panic spread through the ranks. Then the fire came. Dragonfire tore through the battlefield like a living storm. Lines of soldiers broke apart instantly. Shields meant nothing against flames that could melt stone. Within minutes, what had been a disciplined army turned into chaos. Men ran. Horses panicked. Commanders lost control of their forces. These early victories sent a clear message across the Seven Kingdoms. Fighting dragons was nothing like fighting another army. And yet, some kings still believed they could win. The greatest challenge to Aegon came when two of the most powerful kingdoms of Westeros decided to stand together: the Lannisters of the West and the Gardeners of the Reach. Individually, both kingdoms were wealthy and powerful. Together, they could field one of the largest armies ever seen in Westeros. King Loren Lannister and King Mern Gardener formed an alliance. They gathered their forces, tens of thousands of soldiers from across their lands. Knights in shining armor, heavy infantry with long spears, archers ready to fill the sky with arrows. It was an enormous army. Confident in their numbers, the allied kings marched toward Aegon's forces, determined to crush the invaders before the conquest could spread any further. The two armies finally met in an open field. At first, the battle looked like a traditional war between kingdoms. Infantry lines formed. Cavalry prepared to charge. Banners of the West and the Reach flew proudly in the wind. Then the dragons arrived. High above the battlefield, three dark shapes appeared against the sky: Aegon on Balerion, Visenya on Viagar, Rhaenys on Meraxes. The moment the dragons descended, everything changed. The riders circled above the massive enemy army, waiting for the perfect moment. Then they attacked together. Dragonfire erupted across the battlefield. Flames swept through the tightly packed ranks of soldiers. Armor grew red-hot. Wooden shields burst into flames. Horses screamed and bolted in terror. The fire spread quickly through the dry grass of the field. Within moments, the entire battlefield was burning. What had once been one of the largest armies ever assembled in Westeros was suddenly trapped in a nightmare of smoke, fire, and chaos. This battle would become known as the Field of Fire. And the destruction was absolute. Thousands of soldiers died in the flames. King Mern Gardener himself was killed in the inferno, along with most of his family and the noble houses that had marched beside him. The army of the Reach was destroyed in a single afternoon. King Loren Lannister survived, but when he saw the devastation around him, he realized the truth. No army could defeat dragons in open battle. And so, after witnessing the power of Aegon's dragons, Loren Lannister did something that many other rulers would soon do. He surrendered. The King of the West bent the knee to Aegon Targaryen. The conquest of Westeros had truly begun. After the destruction at the Field of Fire, the political landscape of Westeros changed almost overnight. What had once seemed impossible was now undeniable. Dragons could not simply be fought like ordinary enemies. The allied army of the Reach and the Westerlands had been one of the largest military forces ever assembled on the continent. Thousands of knights, tens of thousands of soldiers, banners from dozens of noble houses. And yet, in a single afternoon, it had been destroyed. The message was clear to every ruler in Westeros. If dragons appeared on the battlefield, numbers meant nothing. Castles meant little. Even the most disciplined armies could collapse within minutes under dragonfire. As news of the battle spread across the continent, many rulers began to reconsider their position. Some kings who had once spoken proudly about resisting the Targaryens suddenly grew far more cautious. Others began sending envoys. And one by one, kingdoms started to submit. The process was often surprisingly peaceful. Aegon understood that ruling a continent required stability, not endless destruction. Whenever a lord or king chose to submit willingly, he offered generous terms. They would keep their lands. They would keep their titles. They would continue ruling their regions. But instead of being kings, they would become lords, sworn to the Iron Throne. In exchange for loyalty, Aegon allowed most of the existing noble houses to remain in power. This strategy worked extremely well. Rather than destroying the political structure of Westeros, Aegon simply placed himself at the top of it. And slowly, the Seven Kingdoms began transforming into a single realm. One of the most important submissions came from the north. The Northern Kingdom was ruled by House Stark, whose ancestors had governed the region for thousands of years as the Kings of Winter. At the time of Aegon's conquest, the north was ruled by King Torrhen Stark. When Torrhen heard of the destruction at the Field of Fire, he understood the reality of the situation immediately. The north could field a powerful army, but even the largest northern host could not defeat dragons. Still, Torrhen did not surrender immediately. He gathered his forces and marched south. Thousands of northern soldiers crossed the neck and advanced toward the Riverlands, prepared to face Aegon's army if necessary. For a moment, it seemed possible that another great battle might take place. But when Torrhen Stark finally saw Aegon's forces, and more importantly, when he saw the 3 dragons waiting above the battlefield, he made a decision that would define the future of the North. Instead of fighting, Torrhen Stark chose peace. He approached Aegon's camp. And there, in front of both armies, the King of Winter removed his crown and placed it at Aegon's feet. From that moment forward, Torrhen Stark would be remembered by history with a new title, the King Who Knelt. Some northern lords believed he should have fought, but Torrhen knew that a battle would only bring death and destruction to his people. By bending the knee peacefully, he preserved the strength of the North. Aegon allowed him to remain the ruler of the region not as king, but as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. And so another kingdom joined the growing realm of the Targaryens. Many other regions followed similar paths. Some surrendered after brief conflicts. Others submitted immediately after seeing what had happened to those who resisted. But not every kingdom accepted Aegon's rule so easily. In the far south of Westeros lay a land very different from the rest of the continent. Dorne. The Dornish had always been fiercely independent. Their culture, geography, and traditions set them apart from the other kingdoms. Their lands were harsh and difficult to conquer, filled with deserts, mountains, and strong fortresses. But more importantly, the Dornish people refused to submit. When Aegon sent his message to Dorne, the same message he had sent to every other ruler, the response was clear. They would not bend the knee. They would not surrender their independence. Unlike the other kingdoms, the Dornish were prepared to resist the dragons. And that resistance would turn into one of the longest and most difficult struggles of Aegon's entire conquest. With most of the great kingdoms now submitting to his rule, Aegon Targaryen had accomplished something no one in the history of Westeros had ever achieved. The continent that had once been divided between rival kings was now united under a single ruler. But Aegon understood something important. Victory alone was not enough. If this new realm was going to last, it needed a powerful symbol, something that would remind everyone, from the greatest lord to the smallest knight, that the age of the 7 kings was over. So Aegon decided to create something entirely new. A throne. Not an ordinary throne of wood or gold, but a throne built from the weapons of the kings he had defeated. After every battle and every surrender, Aegon ordered the swords of his enemies to be collected. Thousands of blades were gathered from battlefields, castles, and fallen armies. These swords were brought to the site of his growing city on the Blackwater, the same place where he had first landed when the conquest began. Then came the dragons. Balerion the Black Dread, the largest and most powerful of the 3 dragons, was brought before the massive pile of steel. At Aegon's command, the dragon unleashed his fire. The heat of dragon flame was unlike anything a normal forge could produce. Under Balerion's flames, the swords began to soften, twist, and melt together. The blades bent and fused into one massive structure of tangled metal. Sharp edges jutted out in every direction. Broken blades overlapped and twisted like the branches of a dark metal tree. This process continued again and again as more swords were added to the growing throne. According to legend, the final structure contained the blades of 1,000 defeated enemies. The result was something both impressive and intimidating: the Iron Throne. Unlike the elegant thrones of other kingdoms, the Iron Throne was deliberately uncomfortable. It was tall, jagged, and uneven, with blades sticking out from every side. Sitting on it required caution. One careless movement could easily cut the person who ruled from it, and that was exactly the point. Aegon believed a king should never sit comfortably. The throne was meant to remind every ruler who sat upon it that power was dangerous, and that ruling the 7 kingdoms required constant vigilance. It was not meant to be a seat of luxury. It was a seat of responsibility. Once the throne was completed, Aegon held a grand ceremony to mark the beginning of his rule. Lords from across the newly united realm traveled to witness the moment. In front of nobles, soldiers, and representatives from the great houses of Westeros, Aegon Targaryen was formally crowned. The ceremony itself was simple but powerful. Aegon wore a crown forged from Balerion steel, a dark band shaped with dragon heads circling its edge. He carried the sword Blackfire, the ancestral blade of House Targaryen, and before the gathered lords of Westeros, he took his place upon the Iron Throne. From that moment forward, Aegon was no longer simply the Lord of Dragonstone. He became Aegon the First, King of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm. The Iron Throne became the center of power in Westeros, the seat from which kings would rule the continent for generations to come. But even as Aegon sat upon his new throne, one truth remained. The conquest was not completely finished. In the far south, Dorne still stood independent, and the struggle to bring the entire continent under one crown was not yet over. But one thing was certain: the age of many kings had ended, and the age of the Iron Throne had begun. With Aegon seated upon the Iron Throne, a completely new chapter of Westerosi history began. For thousands of years, the continent had been ruled by separate kings: the kings of winter in the north, the Storm Kings in the Stormlands, the Gardeners in the Reach, and many others whose dynasties stretched deep into the past. That age was over. Now, for the first time in history, Westeros had a single ruler. And with that change came the birth of a new royal dynasty, the Targaryen dynasty. Aegon did not simply conquer the kingdoms and destroy their ruling families. Instead, he reshaped the political structure of the entire continent. Many of the old kings were allowed to continue ruling their lands, but no longer as independent monarchs. They became great lords of the realm, sworn to serve the Iron Throne. House Stark remained the rulers of the north. House Lannister continued ruling the Westerlands. House Arryn still governed the Vale. But now all of them answered to a higher authority: the king in King's Landing. This transformation created something Westeros had never truly experienced before: a unified political system. The Seven Kingdoms were no longer separate nations constantly fighting each other. They were now parts of a single realm. This did not mean conflict disappeared, of course. Rivalries between noble houses still existed, and power struggles would continue for generations. But the presence of the Iron Throne created a new balance. For the first time, there was a central authority capable of intervening in disputes between kingdoms. And behind that authority stood the greatest weapon in the world: dragons. As Aegon's rule continued, the small landing site where he had first built his wooden fort began to grow. More ships arrived in Blackwater Bay. Merchants, craftsmen, soldiers, and nobles traveled there to serve the new king. Markets appeared. Streets formed between growing neighborhoods. Wooden buildings slowly filled the area surrounding Aegon's original stronghold. Over time, the temporary fort that had protected the first landing was replaced by something far more impressive. A massive stone castle began rising on the hill overlooking the bay. This fortress would become known as the Red Keep. Built as the royal residence of the Targaryen kings, the Red Keep quickly became the heart of political power in Westeros. Around it, the city continued to expand. What had once been an empty stretch of coastline was transforming into the largest and most important city in the Seven Kingdoms. This city would soon receive a name known across the world: King's Landing, the capital of the new realm. From King's Landing, the Targaryen kings would rule Westeros for centuries. Lords would travel there to seek alliances, settle disputes, and serve on the king's council. Envoys from distant lands would arrive by ship. Merchants would fill the markets, and armies would gather beneath the banners of the Iron Throne. For the people of Westeros, life was entering a completely new era. The old world of scattered kingdoms and endless wars between rival crowns was fading into the past. In its place stood something different: a single realm, a single royal house. And above them all, watching from the skies when needed, the dragons of House Targaryen. The dynasty that began with Aegon's conquest would shape the fate of Westeros for nearly 3 centuries. And it all started with a small landing on a quiet shore, and 3 dragons that changed the. And so, as the fires of conquest slowly faded, Westeros entered a quieter moment in its long and complicated history. The wars that had once divided the continent were finally settling into silence. For generations, kings had fought endlessly for land, pride, and power. Armies marched across fields, castles rose and fell, and banners changed with every new conflict. But now, something different had taken shape. One throne, one crown, one realm. Aegon Targaryen's conquest had not simply changed who ruled Westeros. It had changed the entire structure of the continent. 7 kingdoms that had once stood apart were now bound together beneath the Iron Throne. Lords who had once been rivals were now part of the same realm. And above them all stood a dynasty that would rule for centuries: the Targaryens. A family that arrived from across the sea, carrying the last dragons of Valyria. Their arrival reshaped the world of Westeros forever. Cities would grow. New alliances would form. New wars would eventually come, as they always do in the history of kingdoms. But for a moment, after the battles, after the flames, and after the crowns had been laid down, there was calm. The beginning of a new era. And that era began in a city built beside the waters of Blackwater Bay. King's Landing. From there, the Iron Throne would watch over the 7 kingdoms for generations yet to come. Now, as this story comes to an end for tonight, it's time to slow things down. Let your mind relax. Let the images of dragons, castles, and ancient kings slowly fade into the background. You've traveled through centuries of history tonight, from the divided kingdoms of Westeros to the rise of a dynasty that changed everything. And now, it's time to rest. In a moment, you'll begin to hear the gentle sound of rain. Soft, quiet your mind. And as the rain continues, allow yourself to drift comfortably toward sleep. Good night, and rest well. Steady, and calming. Let that sound guide your thoughts away from the world of battles and crowns. And so, with Aegon seated upon the Iron Throne, a new era began. The 7 kingdoms, once divided, now stood beneath a single ruler. A realm forged not only by fire and blood, but by vision, patience, and the power of dragons. From that moment on, the fate of Westeros would be forever tied to one name, House Targaryen. And high above the world, when the skies grew dark and silent, the dragons still watched. Guardians of a dynasty, born from fire, and shaped by destiny. But that is a story for another night. For now, the world grows quiet. The battles are over. The crowns have been claimed. And even the dragons have returned to rest. Somewhere, on a distant island, beneath a calm and endless sky, soft flames flicker, and the night carries only silence. So let your mind drift, let your thoughts slow down, and allow yourself to rest. Thank you for being here tonight. If you'd like to return tomorrow, there will be another story waiting for you. But for now, sleep well, and dream of dragons.